Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You know, it's a real privilege to be here, and like the other speakers, I just want to thank the Camden Conference for including me in this really impressive event. It's great to see all the participants, the students, and it's an honor to be here with my fellow speakers as well. Like some of the other speakers, my flight got canceled, of course, given the incoming storm, and I was thinking about, the last time I can remember a weather-related flight cancellation I was in Pyongyang in December 2017. And my flight out of Pyongyang after a week was canceled. And I decided I'd rather be stranded in Maine. Now, over the last 2 days, you've heard how unsettled this moment is for the Middle East. Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, rising Israeli-Turkish tensions, the rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Pivotal upcoming Israeli elections. The region we've been discussing is in flux. And at the same time, this is happening while the wider international system stumbles. As Ian Bremmer put it, the United States is itself unwinding its own global order. Prime Minister Mark Carney from Canada called this at Davos a rupture. And so against that backdrop today, I want to talk on two different themes, not three like Stephanie or Bernard yesterday, just two. First, another look after all the brilliant presentations we've heard over the past couple days at that intersection between US foreign policy and the interests of the Middle Eastern states we've been discussing. And second, let's open the aperture a bit, go beyond the region a bit, and consider the global order as the Trump administration takes basically a wrecking ball to the institutions, the alliances that the United States, more than any other country, has built and sustained for decades. And I speak as someone who's, thanks for the introduction, I speak as someone who served both as a US official focused on the Middle East and a UN official with global responsibilities. So my first theme, that intersection of US and Middle Eastern countries' interests, let me start with an anecdote. When the Biden administration came into office, there were rumors that I was going to be asked to be the US Special Envoy for Syria. Well, back in January 2021, I had no good ideas for Syria. So I sort of very carefully practiced a script to politely say no. But then when the call came, it was a big surprise. To be the first US Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. I had no script prepared for that. And there are lots of Americans, why me? There are lots of Americans who have lived and worked, spent their professional careers in and around the Horn of Africa. And that wasn't me. At the UN, I traveled a lot to the Horn of Africa, but I'm not a Horn of Africa expert, and I said so on the phone call. The response was, hey, Jeff, think about the geopolitical map, not just the geographic map. You know the Arabs, the Turks, the Israelis, and those are the people who are going to have decisive influence on that region. And that was prescient. This was said before Sudanese Civil War erupted and before the hardening of two loose competing alignments. And these two alignments, it's Israel and the UAE on the one side. It's Turkey and Saudi Arabia, often joined by Egypt and Qatar on the other side. These two alliances are now the central drivers of the trajectory of the Middle East, of Sudan, and of the Horn of Africa. The Trump administration is close to all of them. All these countries welcomed the election of Trump, but the administration's ability to transcend the gap between these two loose coalitions remains unproven. Now, we saw a precursor of this during the boycott of Qatar during Trump's first term. But this divide today is deeper, broader, and harder to manage. Take Syria. As we've heard here from Bernie yesterday, Syria is, from others, Syria is in the midst of a historic but fragile transition. The Trump administration is all in behind interim President Ahmed Shara. Riyadh, Doha, Ankara are more or less in the same spot. Israel and the UAE are not. They prefer centrifugal forces inside Syria that would undercut this US goal of a consolidated Syria under Ahmed al-Shara's interim rule. Both Israel and the UAE see the Islamist background of Ahmed Shara as threatening. Both of them would resist seeing Turkey increase its influence in Syria. I don't see either Israel or the UAE adjusting its policies to align with the Trump focus on backing a centralized Syria right now. But the rivalry of these two camps I'm describing, and they're not formal alliances, they're basically sort of informal alignments. The rivalry extends beyond the Middle East to Sudan and the Horn of Africa. So again, widening our aperture a bit. The money, weapons, and political cover of these countries have transformed local conflicts into international proxy battles with incredibly catastrophic humanitarian consequences. And Sudan is now a primary battlefield in this contest. Sudan, host of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe right now. Now, the Trump administration pitched a clever idea to try to stop Sudan's civil war. Build a quad of outside powers: Washington, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Cairo. The idea was simple. The UAE supports one side of the Sudan civil war. Egypt and Saudi Arabia support the other side of the Sudan civil war. If you get consensus among these outsiders, they can use their collective leverage to force their Sudanese clients into a ceasefire. It's a good theory on paper. In practice, it has, at least so far, failed. The Quad issued a ceasefire call in September. The Sudanese armed forces, backed by Egypt and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, flatly rejected it. They're sort of posturing as a government. The Rapid Support Forces, supported by the UAE, pretended to accept the ceasefire call, and then in late October carried out the single worst atrocity of the war, the massacres in El Fasher, in Darfur. And the fighting continues, engulfing every neighboring state. So why did this Quad approach that makes sense on paper collapse? Because our Quad partners understand clearly that Washington has a long list of other issues on which they want their cooperation. This gives our Quad partners the confidence to pick and choose. When are they going to cooperate with the Trump administration, and when can they ignore the Trump administration at relatively low cost? You know, they hear President Trump's repeated denigration of African countries. They note how rarely he mentions Sudan. And they draw the obvious conclusion that ending Sudan's civil war is not really a top priority in the Oval Office, despite the humanitarian consequences. Meanwhile, Sudan's assets, its 530-mile Red Sea coast, its fertile agricultural land, Nile River waters, its gold reserves, are simply too important for one of these sides to allow the other side to win. And so the Quad partners calculate that they can participate in the Quad meetings and discussions with Washington, they can strike a constructive tone, and they can continue to arm the belligerents with very little cost to their relationship with the United States. Now, I experienced this myself firsthand as the US envoy for the Horn of Africa under the Biden administration. The White House regularly asked me to boil down our message on Ethiopia's Tigray War, which was then raging. Ethiopia's Tigray War, by the way, there were estimated 600,000 people killed in that Tigray War from 2020 to 2022. Now that war was also intensified by external interference of the same type I'm describing in Sudan. So I was supposed to boil down what I was talking about to ministers and other officials to like a single talking point or two for President Biden to talk to the regional leaders, to reinforce my message at the very, very top level. And then so the phone calls would happen, the visits would happen, and invariably, I would get a call back from the White House and say, you know, Jeff, thanks for the point, but you know, the agenda was so long, the president never got to Ethiopia. And even if Masad Boulos, who's President Trump's senior Africa advisor, is pushing hard on Sudan, and I actually think he is, The Quad leaders are not naive. If the president consistently fails to mention Sudan, they will conclude that Sudan is not a priority for him, but it is for them, and they will act accordingly. And we see the same dangerous competition between these two loose coalitions around the Bab el-Mandeb. The Bab el-Mandeb is where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden and then onto the Indian Ocean. On December 26, Israel recognized Somaliland. Somaliland is the breakaway part of Somalia. It's on the inside cover of your book on the map where it says Somalia. That's the part of Somalia that's Somaliland. So Israel recognizes Somaliland on December 26th, and the UAE already has assets, military assets in Somaliland, the breakaway region. Saudi diplomacy kicked into high gear, encouraging others not to follow suit with recognition of Somaliland. Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar rushed to reaffirm Somalia's territorial integrity. And about the same time, the UAE's backed Southern Transitional Council in Yemen. Yemeni forces, backed by the UAE, moved against Saudi-backed forces in Yemen, breaking what had been sort of an understanding about UAE controls in Yemen and Saudi control in Yemen. And so from Riyadh's perspective, Riyadh's suddenly looking at the Somaliland, Yemen, and saying, on both sides of the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, that gateway, Saudi access is being bracketed by Emirati and Israeli influence. So Riyadh responded on December 30th by attacking Emirati shipments to the Emirati allies in Yemen. Abu Dhabi reportedly pulled its assets out of Yemen, but the story doesn't end there. Remember Somaliland, I've mentioned. Its so-called president met Eric Trump in Davos. And the pictures from that meeting told the region, rightly or wrongly, that the United States is being directly engaged in the question of recognition and secession along the Red Sea. Now, I keep mentioning these two camps. Well, there are two dynamics that animate these camps, that energize these two camps. One is the very poisonous relationship between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish President Erdogan. It's more than just Turkey and Israel. It's a very personal animosity between these two leaders. And the other is the now very public rivalry between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Now, some will argue that Turkish-Saudi camp is essentially statist, backing central authorities, while the Israeli UAE camp supports secessionist movements to weaken potential rivals. And while there's some truth to that, I question how the Saudi-Turkish support of the Sudanese armed forces in their current form really helps support a central state. To me, this is less about statehood theory and more about power. Who will dominate a strategic region at a time when successive American administrations have wanted to reduce our own footprint? And the stakes are not abstract. The risk of an all-out war in the Horn of Africa, triggered by these same regional rivalries, is real. Even as we meet here today, Ethiopia, the second most populous state on the African continent, and Eritrea, egged on by these same outsiders, are saber-rattling. The risk of war is real. Now, my second theme transcends the larger Middle East, Red Sea Basin area, which is how do we promote peace in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan, in the Middle East, or anywhere, when the system that was established after World War II, built to safeguard peace, is losing both relevance and support. We're living through a crisis of faith in the institutions, the alliances, the treaties, and the understandings that were constructed after World War II. Now, this so-called post-war order was never completely static. It moved from a very early vision of the UN as an instrument of the so-called four policemen and their spheres of influence, through Cold War polarity and decolonization, into post-Cold War US hegemony, US predominance, and finally into whatever you want to call this more messy arrangements now. But throughout all this period, one constant remained. The United States as the primary architect, manager, benefactor, and yes, beneficiary of the system. So what happens when the system's main sponsor loses interest or even grows actively hostile to its own creation? And we're in a precarious moment. Despite the crisis in multilateralism, globalization itself has not slowed. Think about China's $1.2 trillion trade surplus last year. Challenges from pandemics to climate change ignore borders, yet the familiar international architecture to manage all this is crumbling before our eyes, and the US maintenance crew has walked off the job. The gap between the expanding reach of globalization and the shrinking ambition for global governance widens by the day. Now, the system we inherited helped prevent another great power war. I'm not minimizing the wars that we've been discussing here, the wars that have taken place elsewhere, but in terms of an actual global conflagration, the post-war system has helped prevent that. But it did so not only through the formal rules that have been established since World War II. The key ingredients for success of the so-called rules-based international order in preventing World War III included self-restraint and deterrence. The great powers, chastened by 80 million people killed in two world wars, and acutely aware of the risks of nuclear annihilation, exercised restraint. At key moments, the United States restrained its incredible power in favor of global cooperation that it did not fully control. And the UN Charter itself rests on an implicit bargain that the great powers, though strong enough to violate the very principles of that charter, would voluntarily, yes, if inconsistently, refrain from doing so. Restraint is in short supply today. I don't think anyone's going to accuse Trump, Putin, or Xi Jinping of being crippled by excessive self-restraint. And the post-Cold War order also depended on deterrence. But how credible are US security guarantees today? If allies like Japan, the Republic of Korea, Germany, Poland, question US reliability, the nuclear nonproliferation regime, already sort of a little bit threadbare, is going to further unravel. And we could see Egypt, UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia following suit. China is in the process of quadrupling its nuclear arsenal. The Russians are testing very dangerous new systems. The last Russian-US arms control arrangement expired earlier this month. President Trump has vowed to restart nuclear testing. We're at a very dangerous moment in terms of the nuclear file. But meantime, we see the contours of a new kind of arms race that could also lead to conflict. The race for critical minerals, for energy security, water, for dominance in artificial intelligence. These too could provoke great power conflict, or perhaps smaller power conflict that sucks in the great powers. We need to explore how to restore deterrence, how to deter the US and China from heading to war, how to deter great powers from seizing territory or assets from weaker states, how to deter minor conflicts from becoming proxy wars that drag in the great powers that lead to another world war. And given the risk of human extermination, the nuclear issue to me seems particularly urgent. China consistently rebuffs efforts to join nuclear talks. Washington and Moscow don't seem particularly interested right now. So could we widen the circle? Could we initiate nuclear talks in some form among all P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, to make it harder for some of these states to say no? Even during the height of the Cold War, the Security Council was a venue to start some of the disarmament talks of that period. And with artificial intelligence, we face the danger of weapons being employed without meaningful control. And perhaps it's time to take a cue from Eisenhower. Should we create an IAEA for AI? That is an international agency for artificial intelligence to protect the world from the worst risks of AI while more equitably spreading the benefits of AI. And I've got other ideas I'm skipping because I'm coming close to the end of my time here. But in this polarized world, we will not achieve UN consensus for any proposal. We need to aim for the largest possible coalition and hope others will come on board. And I'm all for helping the next UN Secretary General, who will be elected later this year, to revive quiet diplomacy, to prevent and resolve conflicts before they metastasize into great power wars. I have no romantic notion about the UN. It's not that the UN is a particularly magical tool, but the UN remains the most powerful symbol of our aspirations for a treaty-based international order and for peaceful global cooperation. And this is not multilateralism's first crisis. We can all come up with a list: Srebrenica, Rwanda, Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine. The list of failures is long. But what is new is that the engine behind international cooperation, the United States and its Western partners, has stalled. Yes, the United States has at times acted contrary to the rules that we, more than anyone else, did to draft. And yes, the United States and its partners have been on the opposite sides before. The Iraq War comes to mind. But until now, we have never seen a sustained effort by the United States to denigrate and distance itself from our transatlantic allies. I, for one, do not think it's very reassuring to think about Greenland and say, well, I guess it could have been worse. Peace will not preserve itself. And the post-war order needed reviving and refreshing even before the current crisis. But who's going to step forward and chart a new path in the absence of US leadership? China certainly has weight. But China has shown no interest. Maybe this is good. But China has shown no interest in replacing the United States as the protector of global public goods. So where does that leave us? As the pushback against the seizure of Greenland illustrated, the middle powers do have some leverage. And for them, the middle powers, the rest of the world, I suggest a three-part agenda. First, find ways to build collective deterrence against predation from great powers, i.e. build on the Greenland example. Second, establish new rules and norms of behavior, new frameworks to govern peacefully the race for rare minerals, energy resources, and AI, and invite others on board. Third, come together around ideas to protect the essential operating systems for an interconnected world, the interconnected world in which we live in areas like protection of global health, the global financial system, and freedom of navigation. These are areas that the Trump administration has abandoned. And perhaps one day, the United States will again view alliances as assets, not as burdens. But for now, we need to establish the broadest coalition of leaders and countries who insist on refreshing the very idea that gave us 8 decades without world war, that our security is bound up with the security of others, and that restraint and cooperation are not signs of weakness, but the highest expressions of confidence and strength. Thank you.
I actually just wanted to talk with you for a bit, or hear from you more about China, because as you mentioned, you said China isn't interested in playing the role of the protector of the peace. But how would you describe what China's current influence or intentions are in the Middle East and/or the Horn of Africa?
There was a quip when I worked at the UN. There was sort of a quip that the European countries overestimate the value of multilateralism. The United States underestimates the value of multilateralism, and the Chinese want to change multilateralism. And there's some truth to that, and of course we've seen the Chinese create new institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the leadership behind the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I'm not particularly concerned about that because we did the same thing for years. We had sort of a layer of multilateral institutions that worked in tandem, the OECD, the World Bank, IMF, the UN. There's a whole bunch of, there's sort of a layered multilateralism, and China wants to add some of its own layers to it. That doesn't particularly concern me. But China is very good at playing within the existing system. I mean, I think Stephanie would agree with me. We saw this when we were both working at the United Nations, where the Chinese never missed a single thing in any of the discussions. Whereas the U.S. was more of the feeling, we're the U.S. People are going to listen to us because we're the U.S. They didn't do this homework in the same way that the Chinese did. But what concerns me is that the Chinese don't seem to be taking an interest in, well, I mean, maybe it shouldn't concern me. Maybe I'm relieved by this. But the U.S., I'll start over. The U.S. for decades has done things like protect the freedom of navigation. That's a global public good. The United States for decades has underpinned the international financial system. That's a global public good, even if we are beneficiary more than others. The Chinese don't seem to be interested in that. So if we pull back, do we start to have a deterioration in the global public goods that an interconnected world needs? That's what concerns me. I don't want the Chinese to take over all this stuff, but I also am concerned about what happens if the infrastructure of an interconnected world is no longer maintained by the United States and nobody else is stepping up.
Okay, looks like we have one here, at mic 2.
Hi, I'm Anya. I'm a student at Bates College.
Hi.
The often cited rationale for Russia's war in Ukraine was what it perceived as the threat of Ukraine joining NATO, but the emerging concern now is that the absence of a security guarantee from the US, just wider, might embolden power grabs and quests for territory, and it might normalize appeasement. Do you think it's now possible to strike a balance between the two?
It's a very good question, and I think it would be a huge mistake to recognize de jure, legally, annexation of another country's territory by force, whether it's the U.S. and Greenland, whether it's Russia and Ukraine. I do not believe that Ukraine in the near future is going to be able to regain all of its territory. But I do think that we have to come up with some kind of approach that doesn't give the Russians the de jure recognition, because that throws away one of the principles that was established after World War II, which is the rejection of acquisition of territory by force. There have actually been very few examples since World War II of the acquisition of territory by force. There have been some, but they're not many. And if you look back at history, that acquisition of territory by force, whether we're talking about Central and Eastern Europe in the 18th century, or the colonization of Africa, Asia in the 19th century, it was the acquisition of territory by force that led to so many conflicts and so much bloodshed. And I'm really worried that the Trump administration might throw away that principle, or might intentionally violate that principle.
Up here we have a question at mic 3.
Yes. Good morning, Ambassador Feltman. I'm Nazia Sheikh from University of Maine. My question to you, do you, as a special envoy in Horn of Africa, have better policy advice to current administration rather targeting Somali communities in Minnesota? Sorry, it's a bit controversial, but I needed to ask.
What's the last part again?
Do you have better policy advice to the current administration rather targeting the Somali communities in the Minnesota?
While they're targeting Somali communities, or rather than?
Rather targeting.
I mean, I'm appalled by the attacks on the Somali community in Minneapolis. This is part of the fabric of this country, is the welcoming of I mean, I think probably most of us here at some point we're immigrants. There may be some indigenous, but most of us are immigrants in one form or another, so it's appalling. But what I also find deeply distressing is the lack of concern, and it's not just the Trump administration, although it's worse than the Trump administration, the lack of real concern about the people who are living in these places like Ethiopia and Somalia. as I said, there were 600,000 people estimated to be killed in that Tigray war from 2020 to 2022. And yet President Biden couldn't be bothered to mention it to Abdullah bin Zayed, who was funding the drones that were being used to attack the Tigrayans. There's something wrong with us if we ignore the human cost. And I don't remember any university protests against the Tigrayan war, for example. But it's more than, so I mean, at the human level, I'm absolutely distressed by the inattention paid to conflicts that metastasize into something that becomes proxy wars, as we've seen in Ethiopia and in Sudan. But at a strategic level, it's also not good news. Stephanie mentioned the issue of migration to Europe that took place because of the Syrian Civil War and because of other civil wars, and the impact that had on politics in Europe. And the change in politics in Europe also had an impact on change of politics here. So there's not only the human cost of ignoring these conflicts, there is the strategic cost of ignoring these conflicts, whether it be political or economic. 40% of all container traffic goes to the Red Sea. Imagine if the Red Sea is in total chaos, and that's not possible.
Mike 2.
My name is Sophia Scrivenich. I'm a senior at Islesboro Central School, and I have a two-part question for you. So first is, what do you believe the future of sort of soft power negotiation and mediation in North Africa and the Middle East will be? And then the second part of my question is, on what part do you think, on the US's part, do you think can be done in terms of what's being given in terms of funding and attention by the administration currently in order to have a US role in this negotiation and mediation? Thank you.
One thing I learned when I was at the United Nations is that conflict prevention, the theory is you want to prevent conflict. It's much easier to prevent the fire in your house than to put the fire out once the house is caught on fire, or to rebuild the house once the house is burned down. So the theory is you want to prevent conflict. In practice, that's really, really hard. No country likes to have a UN envoy show up and say, hey, let me talk about your conflict. Oh no, Jeff, we got this under control. Don't worry your pretty little head over this. This is under control. So, and no country wants to be under Security Council scrutiny, which they're afraid that an official mediator showing up is going to put them under Security Council scrutiny, when in fact it's the opposite. The mediator's trying to prevent the conflict, so to prevent the Security Council from needing to pay attention to it. But it's hard to convince that. And the other thing is, to do conflict prevention, you have to talk to both sides. What country wants to have an international figure talk to the rebels? That they would see that as basically empowering the rebels, legitimizing the rebels, when they just want to kill the rebels or stop the rebels. So the conflict prevention and mediation is great in theory, it's really hard in practice. But it gets to the other part of your question, which is, I found to do conflict prevention successfully, you have to have some outside powers that have influence on the governments that you're trying to convince mediation is worthwhile. And I'll take one. You guys never heard of the war between Equatorial Guinea and Gabon because it didn't happen. And conflict, and it's one of those things that you don't, as a UN official, I didn't really want to tout our role because I wanted the local governments to feel responsible, empowered for this. But Equatorial Guinea were headed toward war over an undetermined border, including maritime border that had hydrocarbon reserves. So this was about resources, it was about borders, about sovereignty, and lots of saber rattling. They were clearly moving toward war, and we at the UN were trying to make sure this didn't happen. And but how do you do that when both countries say, no, we don't want you. We're going to fight for our land. We're going to fight for our rights. We're going to determine this. Well, we got neighboring countries that were scared of the potential of a war and refugee flows, as well as some of the old colonials who still had influence, to be behind us, to be able to say, you guys listen to the UN. And we eventually came up with an approach that led to an eventual demarcation of the border and prevented war. Now, would war have broken out if we hadn't been there? I don't know for sure. But I do think it's an example of how you do prevention in this modern world. And that's why I think that, as much as I'm appalled by a lot of the stuff the Trump administration is doing, I think the basic approach to Sudan was right. That you get the people, you get the outsiders. So the insiders aren't going to talk to each other, they're just going to kill each other. Get the outsiders who are fueling this conflict together and force them to work on their clients. The theory is good, but we have to be able to use our leverage with the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis. And when the agendas are so long, as I said, probably President Trump doesn't put Sudan very high. He's not going to use his leverage on Sudan when other parts might be, when there might be something else with Saudi Arabia or the UAE that has financial implications that he would prefer focusing on rather than Sudan.
I see up here, microphone 3.
Hello, I'm Miles Hibble from the University of Maine. You mentioned that if the United States kind of backed up on its global influence, that you were worried that no one would step in, like China. Could we not function properly as a global, international society without kind of having a hegemonic figure, kind of facilitating everything?
Well, I think we're going to find out. Spheres of influence haven't been particularly stable in the past because there's no real determination of where one sphere ends and the other sphere starts. But I suspect that we're going to find out whether it's true. And again, I'm the first to say that U.S. hegemony was not done out of benevolence. I think that on general, the world benefited from the U.S. protection of global public goods, but the benefits did not accrue equitably across the globe. So I'm a proponent of U.S. leadership, while recognizing the fact that if you're sitting elsewhere in the globe, you might not look the same. I'm very. I think that it's an accomplishment that we haven't had a world war in 80 years. But if you're one of the 600,000 families of one of the 600,000 Tigrayans killed, you're not going to say, well, gosh, isn't it good they were killed in a local war and not in a world war?
Well, we're going to wrap up with a remote question that comes from Heidi Whitney in North Waterboro. How would you make the case to someone disengaged from global events that these issues matter, especially when U.S. media often gives limited international coverage?
Yeah. Heidi, you have identified a real problem. Think about how difficult it is for all of us who are trying to stay informed of international events to find out what's actually going on in a source that we can trust. Because if you can Google anything or use any kind of AI to say, okay, what's happening in Sudan now? But how likely is it that you're going to get an objective view of what's happening in Sudan rather than one side trying to persuade you? But I think that the case I would make may not be very compelling I grew up in the rural Midwest. Maybe it would not be compelling when I go back to my hometown. But I think that we benefited tremendously from U.S. leadership. And yes, we underwrote the system. But the benefits to us in terms of our own economic growth, in terms of the talent that came to this country because of the research grants, because of the immigration that attracted talent, that this whole system worked to make our country what it is today, and I really don't want to see us lose all that.
Well, Ambassador, thank you
very much.
Thank you. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. See you here at 11.